My name is Boghossian. I'm going to be the moderator of this event today. And the topic of our event today is the presidential election in the United States next week. And we have also a title for this event, Fight for the White House. And we have here two distinguished speakers invited. First, I'm going to start with your introduction, and then we, in order to keep things going, we will discuss the questions I have. I have lots of questions. So let me introduce you first. Gábor Csizmazia. He is a research fellow at the John Lukacs Institute for Strategy and Politics at the Ludovika University of Public Service. He's a research assistant of the Ludovika University. I suppose he has also teaching assignments. Yeah, right, okay. And his researches include security policy of the United States, political structure of the United States, transatlantic relations. He's the author of many articles, and he's a co-author of a very important and interesting book, The American Evangelical Movement. You have to know that, that in Hungary and in Europe, it's really hard to map the religious landscape of the United States. And this is a very good guide, right? Okay. So congratulations to this book. On my right side is Peter Boghossian from the United States with a beautiful Armenian name. Do you have also Hungarian ancestors?
Not to my knowledge, no.
All right, never mind. But are you Transylvanian, aren't you? Partly.
I have no idea.
All right, never mind. Okay.
I'm pure American.
All right. So here we have a pure American professor, Peter Boghossian. He had his BA in psychologist, MA in philosophy from Fordham University, and he received his Doctor of Education in 2004 from the Portland State University. His primary interests are critical thinking, moral reasoning, especially philosophy of education. He's the author of the books like a manual for creating atheists and how to have impossible conversations. Interesting titles. And now I'm going to quote from his CV from the Wikipedia. All right. So in an interview with Dave Rubin, Boghossian described himself as a classical liberal who never voted for a Republican candidate, but it is not a fan of the Democrats. He stated that any of the Republican candidates for the 2016 presidential election would be, I quote, would be an unmitigated disaster, he says. He donated and endorsed Andrew Young for the 2020 United States presidential election. He has stated that the U.S. Republican Party is the most powerful anti-science political movement in the world. He wrote that it was not alarmist to state that they could destroy the world, since many refuse to even acknowledge that climate change is happening. And he stated that their denialist attitude is due to partly to their religious convictions.
I deny all of this.
All right, all right.
This is all propaganda by the far
okay,
left.
my last quotation from here. And
keep going, though. Keep
all right.
going.
So anyway, according to Boghossian, the regressive left have taken over academia. It's all nice anyway, but don't you think that you are the enfant terrible of the American intelligentsia in this sense? Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, so I will have some questions first, okay? Or you want to reflect immediately on your CV?
No, I actually wanted to tell the story of why I was
right,
late.
Okay.
Because I think this is a great story. So I went to the wrong location. I went to the Scruton Cafe. And so I walked into the Scruton Cafe. Don't worry, this won't take long. It's a great story, though. So I walked into the Scruton Cafe, and this man said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yes, I'm here for the event. My name is Peter." He said, "Okay, the event is downstairs." So I went downstairs, and sure enough, the name Peter is right there, and I walked to the stage, and I took the chair of the person who was also named Peter, whose chair it was on stage. And the other man hosting the panel said something to me in Hungarian, and trust me when I tell you, you do not want to know the 3 words of Hungarian that I know. So I said, he said, "You know, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, you know, my name is Peter, and I'm here for this event." And so he said, "Okay," and so he sat down, and then everyone was looking at me, and I said, "Hello, welcome to the event," and in English, and then he left, and everyone was looking at me like I had some kind of a problem. And then this woman walked over to me, and she said, do you know why you're here?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Do you know that you're at this event?" And I said, I do. And she said, "Well, what's your name?" And I said, "Well, my name is Peter." And it's a remarkable coincidence. And so then everybody kept looking at me, and they left the room because they didn't know what to do. He eventually came back down, and we figured out that I was in the wrong event. It just happened to be named Peter. Now, I don't think any larger lesson can be pulled from this story. But I do find it interesting when you don't speak a language how wonderful the Hungarian people were, because they weren't laughing at me, they were laughing with me, because it was such a funny, weird coincidence that was my name, and I'm sitting at the front. I'm sitting at the front of the whole studio. Everybody's looking at me. It was a very funny experience. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. How welcome they made what they must have thought I was some crazy homeless man. How welcome they made me feel.
All right, nice story. Anyway, so back to the 2020-24 elections. Life is funny, don't you think?
Yeah, it's a funny story.
Okay. So I have a short list of questions, but first, question 0, basics. What do we have to know about the presidential elections in terms of the whole system? I mean, we Hungarians, we are not familiar with this whole system and the process of electing the President of the United States. And now I am asking you, Gábor, if you can.
It was actually a funny story. It actually happened to me it was before COVID. We have a course titled Regional Studies, and it basically is divided among the researchers and the academic staff based on whoever's area of expertise we're talking about. And I was going there with Central Europe with a presentation, and I actually gave a full 90-minute long presentation to the wrong group. Meanwhile, so it happens. It happens.
In Hungarian?
That was in Hungarian. They were Hungarian, so and they were so shy they didn't dare to.
Is there anybody who wants to answer
wrong
my
place,
question?
wrong time. Meanwhile, the actual teacher who was supposed to give the presentation showed up, and I said, politely asked him to leave because, well, I'm having the presentation right now.
You know, it would have been super funny if you gave it in Hungarian. Literally nobody spoke Hungarian.
Back to the question,
right,
gentlemen.
back to the question.
Right.
So, hello everyone.
Discipline, please. More discipline for
more discipline, right.
speakers.
Well, wait until we get to the Congress, especially the House of Representatives, where you can see similar events or scenes play out. So to get to answer the question, there are many things to talk about the American electoral system or presidential system. I believe the emphasis here that I would, if I'm talking to or with Hungarian or European audiences, is basically this. It's the presidential system. And usually when people hear the expression presidential system, they immediately come to the conclusion of a strong executive, a strong president, which is true. The founding fathers did want a strong president under the 1787 Constitution. However, presidential system also means that the the electorate, so the people who vote politicians into power, they actually cast their votes for for the future president, whoever that person may be, but they also cast votes when it comes to the lower house, so the House of Representatives, 435 representatives altogether, plus we have an election in the Senate, 34 senators specifically. So this is important because, in other words, we are not just, or the electors are not just electing the next president of the United States, but also have their votes do have an impact on the legislature. So on the power ratio, or the ratio of power within the Senate and within the House of Representatives. My experience so far is that when it comes to the general public, few people talk about it, at least here in Hungary and in Europe, even though it's extremely important, because as much power the president has, especially when it comes, for example, to foreign policy, Congress, through legislation, can actually limit these powers in practice. So whoever will be the president after, well, November 5th, 6th, or whenever they will eventually count the votes, it's also important to see whether that person will face a so-called divided government, which means that the other party is in the majority in either house of Congress. Right now it seems that I believe, according to the latest polls, the Senate will probably flip, so 51-49 to the Republicans, which will be a change, and we have no idea, at least I have no idea, about the House of Representatives, where we have 32 seats as toss-ups. My guess is that it will also flip. So right today we have a very thin, razor-thin Republican majority, but my guess is that it will flip to a Democratic majority. We'll see whether that be razor thin or not, and we'll see who will be the president. But it is most likely, I believe, that whoever will be president will probably face a divided government, which will bring in later on issues of basically budgetary concerns to articles of impeachment. We'll see. So that's there are many things to talk about, but I believe this is the main message that I would highlight. There's the presidential system, and the people cast votes in all branches, all two branches of government.
Peter, is that a proper system in the sense that it's a modern system? Is it working?
So now I will stick to the fidelity of the question that you've asked me to. So when you ask what do Hungarians need to know, the question can be taken two ways. They need to know the structure, which you spoke to somewhat, and then they need to know the ideological or exogenous concerns that people have. So with the structure, Hungary is a country of around 10 million people. That's roughly the population of LA County. The United States has 50 states, about 333 million people at the last census. So the way that the system is set up and established is we have something called the Electoral Congress. So you can win. This is a very bizarre notion, and I can explain why if anyone is actually interested. Every so often people talk about wanting to dissolve the Electoral Congress, but the idea is that one can win the popular vote and lose the election. Let me repeat that because that's shocking to people who are not from the US. Al Gore won the popular vote, but he lost the election. And the reason for that is, and again, this is a very big country. The reason for that is because if this is the structural part and not the ideological part of the question. If the most populated counties and states are California, Texas, and Florida, et cetera, and if the president or presidential candidates only campaigned in certain areas, they would only go to those areas, and then the middle of the country, places that are less populated, wouldn't have representation. They wouldn't have votes. So the system has been set up so that it will be a country for everyone because of its size. So that's one thing I think that's important to know structurally. And you're right, like for example, for the president to declare war, you need what's called the War Powers Act. So there are a multitude of structural issues in the United States, and you're right about everything you said was accurate. I disagree about whether or not the House will flip, but that's another story.
We'll see.
We'll see, right? I mean, so that's the other thing. All bets are off in these elections. They come down to the wire. The other thing is the ideological considerations. In 1993, Huntington published a piece in Foreign Affairs, the famous Samuel Huntington, about the clash of civilizations, and it was coming off of a post-Cold War era. And one of the things he said is that the fault lines of the future will not be on economic lines, communist, socialist, et cetera. They will be on civilizational lines. And so he identified, I think it was 7 civilizations. He later published that book in 1996, which was fascinating. But I think what you see now is you see, what Hungarians need to know, you see deep ideological divisions in which the traditional fault lines aren't there. So I would divide that into economic policy, social policy, and what my colleague from the Danube Institute, Colin Nicholson, continue to call our event neoliberalism. I don't like that framing, but we'll just use it as a fiat placeholder. So what do Hungarians need to know? They need to know that what you're seeing here is not the collapse of grand narratives. It's competing grand narratives. It's competing narratives based upon geopolitical and larger economic pressures in an increasingly interconnected world. And I can set that, what I see as a clear dichotomy up for you. On one side, you have, and I'll let you guess who this is, you have a kind of Politburo. Instead of a Politburo, you have mostly white women with pronouns in their bios and in their name tags. And you have people who say that if some individuals lose a race, then the whole concept of racing must be dismantled. So not only can we not have a race, the whole idea of running a race or running a marathon. You have fundamental differences in orientation to social, economic, and I hope we can get into this later, geopolitical differences, for example, funding of Ukraine, the role that racism plays, the fentanyl crisis, the homeless crisis that affect largely blue states. Another way to look at this is to look at the ultra-billionaire Balaji and how he divides blue cities and red cities and blue states and red states. Are you flashing me to tell me I've spoken long enough? Okay.
No. Go ahead. All right. Okay. So this is the situation of today now. But I'm interested in the history also. How can we understand the situation of today? How far we have to go back in order to understand the situation of today? Because there is clearly a tension. Great tension.
What situation specifically?
What we experience today. What we experience today, the tension between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the tension between the fundamental geographical differences. I'm interested now in the historical background of this whole story.
Okay, so
historical ideological background.
Okay, so if the premise of the question is, what is causally responsible for the realignment? Like, why is Dick Cheney not supporting Donald Trump? It's a really good question. So, extending a hermeneutic of charity, if that's the question, I would say that you go back to 2014. That's the peg date. That's when things started to change. That's when the ideological capture of institutions became more pronounced. That's when the division between the red states and the blue states. That's also when the big sword, as Cushing and Dunning have pointed out, started to occur, which was more people started physically moving into areas in which there was a political realignment. So it wasn't just an ideological realignment along voting lines. People voted with their feet. And a great example of that is we just moved out of, one of my colleagues is here, we just moved out of Portland, Oregon. Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, California. There are 2 states that people exited. People exited Oregon and people exited California, both blue states. And where did they go? They exited universally to 2 red states. They exited to Texas, and they exited to Florida. And if you look at the demographics of Texas and Florida, even the cities, the real estate markets, et cetera, had boomed in those cities. When you ask people why did they move, it wasn't, you know, family. It wasn't, which was traditional. James Carville said James Carville was to Bill Clinton as Karl Rove was to George Bush. He was kind of the analyst. It's the economy, stupid. So in this case, it wasn't the economy. People were leaving on for ideological reasons. And we know that because we've done polls where we ask people, well, why did you move? So I think if you go back to 2014, and then you can take a slow journey, like what happened from 2014 to 2024. Some people, maybe Jonathan Haidt would say you could push it to 2012, 2010, but I think certainly no earlier than 2010.
I would agree. My watershed moment in this regard was 2012, the presidential elections, because up until then, the Obama campaign was basically could be regarded as a unifying campaign. So basically, in 2008, I don't want to talk much about the 2008 presidential elections, but back then, certainly from the outside, it seemed that President Obama would unite the country. In the shadow of the economic and financial crisis or recession, and of course the ongoing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course lots of ongoing social and economic issues back home. And there was, I believe, some sort of unity that definitely on the left, I would say, in 2008. The 2012 campaign was different because I believe that's when well, the Obama campaign sort of took the mask off in a sense that, for example, I'll give you an example. I believe it was, do correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was a 2008 campaign where President Obama was asked about how he defines marriage. And that's when he said, mind you, at a specific audience, so not openly, but at a specific audience, he said that marriage is basically a social contract. I can't quote him particularly, but a social contract between a man and a woman. There was a pause at that moment, and people were cheering because that was a specific audience that was looking forward for this kind of answer. Fast forward to 2012, and then the following 4 years, and that's when basically the progressive agenda of the Obama administration took momentum. So after 2012, plus in the 2012 presidential campaign, if you recall, the nominee on the Republican side was Mitt Romney, who definitely was not a Trumpian figure, still not a Trumpian figure today, and yet if you see the attacks or the assaults from the Democrat side was basically very similar assaults as if today, that he's bigot, he's sexist, he's homophobe, he's racist, and so on. And by the way, I saw similar parallels, not to the full extent, but against the late John McCain. So basically, that was the point, I believe, 2012, when some on the right in America sort of got fed up with this. And by 2016, they basically said that, well, if you're going to make baseless accusations against some of our candidates, then you know what, we're going to send a troll. We're going to send someone who's going to, as some quote on the right, as a quote of mud monster, meaning that, well, they may have scandals, but you can't really cope with that the traditional way in political campaigns. And some, for example, the aforementioned evangelical community, who were very sensitive in these issues, actually received lots of support from this particular candidate. I'm talking about Donald Trump at the time in 2016. I would add another thing. I cannot name the specific watershed in this regard, but in the 2016 Trump campaign talked about the so-called deplorables. Well, the Trump campaign didn't talk about the deplorables, but refers to that particular segment of society. Mainly Hillary Clinton talked about them or referred to them as deplorables. Already during the Obama administration, and by particularly President Obama, these people were referred to as bitter clingers. So people who are basically who do not keep pace with the natural, quote-unquote, natural trends of globalization, either in terms of culture or in terms of economics. So in short, and without any pun intended, the losers of globalization. And the reason I point this out is this was in 2016. In 2020, this will be my last example, in 2020, already actually before 2020, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden, actually said openly in the campaign, and he wrote it down in some of his papers, that as much as we dislike Trump, he had something there with regards to the losers of globalization. We need to support some of the middle class in the United States somehow by reapproaching international trade deals or reapproaching international lines of or supply chains, or just in terms of economics. They just call it, they don't call it America First, but they call it a foreign policy for the middle class, for example. They don't call it tariffs, they call it industrial policy strategy or industrial strategy. The 2022 National Security Strategy, for example, uses that term, which according to some experts is just a nice label for some sort of protectionism. So in other words, there were structural problems in several parts of the American society that both sides shared, but it was the right, I would say, the quote-unquote national populist right that said it out loud first. And there are other issues in American society that the two sides do not share, where it comes, for example, the issue of racism or the equality, equity debate that I believe you hinted.
Big one.
Yeah, that's a huge one. I would say that also goes back to 2012, or at least to the concept maybe with Obamacare or with the Affordable Health Care Act, which again basically made the people who were not dependent on it basically pay for the health care of others, which sounds a charitable thing if it's done voluntarily. If it's not, basically it was done through an individual mandate as it was what's going on. It raises questions. But anyway, to sum it up, I believe it was the 2012 presidential elections that sort of rang the bell for some in American society. And there are other interesting movements in during the second term of the Obama presidency that was alarming generally for, I would say, not just to the right in general, but to conservatives, mainstream conservatives, that led them to, well, flood eventually, not in huge numbers though, but to opt for the Trumpian kind of solution. By the way, I believe a similar trend has happened on the left, some on progressives. It's just not that visible because they have the upper hand in some, well, basically, as you mentioned, the Politburo or in some of the political infrastructures. But similar trends, I believe, can be drawn on the other side of the political aisle.
So I want to piggyback off of a few things you said. Many people either they don't know this or they've memory hold it. Memory hold means it's just a term that means they've either chosen to intentionally forget it, or the news cycle is so quick that they just forget it. You're correct to point out that Obama in his first term was against gay marriage, and his second term he flipped on that. And now those are protean concerns, but I think the helpful way to look at this, or way to categorize this, are the three areas of which I had spoken before. They're social areas, and gay marriage is one of them. Nobody cares about gay marriage anymore. So that's been, the Overton window has shifted on that. We've considered that to be resolved. And also on that social issue, you had mentioned that we look at it, the LGB is now separating from the T, lesbian, bisexual, gay, separating from the T. So there are social issues, and again, you're right, those are massive issues. We haven't barely touched on those. Then there are economic issues. The Clinton, particularly the Clinton's first term, he was gung-ho, another American expression, on NAFTA. And so the North American free trade. And so what Clinton wanted to do is he wanted free enterprise zones. And at the time, excuse me, in the late 90s, in the early 90s, up into the mid-90s, and to a certain extent an argument could be made to the late 90s, one of the things that you saw are those geopolitical divisions based upon areas or regions of the world, the EU zone, kind of these trade blocks that were emerging, and the United States wanted to have a commensurate trade bloc with Mexico and Canada. So I think you could also, and I think you're right, others have pointed out, there's a pedigree, a longer pedigree that the deplorables of which Hillary Clinton spoke are the people who have, in a very real sense, been victimized by, in that sense, I would use the word neoliberalism. But the other thing that I think is indispensable for these kinds of conversations is you can't really understand, if you really want to have a more comprehensive understanding of the questions, you have to look at it in terms of geopolitics. Like, you have to look at it in terms of who wants to do what to whom. What role should the United States play? For too long, and you know, that's a question that's emerged again in the last 10 years, and I had mentioned Ukraine, and there's I wouldn't say Trump's an isolationist, but he is certainly,
agree.
Yeah, I think he certainly takes that turn, excuse me, more than Harris, and perhaps we can talk about what that means. But I think looking at this as three pieces of the larger puzzle, and if you really want to know what people vote on, assuming that the economy is stable, there's something called the misery index. And right now the misery index is at 6.5%. The misery index is a combination of unemployment and inflation. And it gives you a really good idea of how ordinary Americans are doing in every day. Excuse me. I'm getting over a cold. And that's been the lowest it's been since Trump took office. Now, there are other concerns like COVID, et cetera, so it's kind of not actually fair, because there was I don't know if you'd call it a catastrophic event, but it was certainly treated as a catastrophic event, and that caused economic problems. We're still feeling the reverberations of those economic problems, particularly mostly in the middle of the country, and you also feel a little bit in manufacturing hubs in Pennsylvania and in some cities in the East Coast.
All right. We still have a huge list of questions, and do
you want us to just rapid fire? You just shoot them, and we just.
Look. Sometimes we say it's a historical event, and there are clearly historical events in history, and it seems to us, for Hungarians, for us who are watching the events of this presidential election, that it's going to be a historical event, and this is going to be take place next week, Tuesday. But is that really a historical event for you, Peter? In the sense that, is that just one election among the many, or is that something more? Is it something more important? In other words, what is at stake in the case of the presidential elections of next week?
That is the only question that needs to be asked tonight, in my opinion.
Yeah, all right. So
it's the most important question of the evening.
What is at stake now?
So what is at stake is what kind of country we want to have.
Right.
What is at stake is what kind of future we want to have. What is at stake specifically? Here's what's at stake. Okay, that's a huge question. Okay, I'm gonna answer the question in three, and using the framework that I laid out. Right. What's at stake economically? We have massive debt problems now. Nobody really seems to care about that in the United States. The interest payments on the debt now are the third largest budget item. That's astonishing. That's just an absolutely flabbergasting. And in 4 years, both under Harris and under Trump, it's widely perceived. That was the Economist's lead article this week on their app. And that was the Wall Street Journal had a wonderful piece just recently about that. In a very short period of time, it's going to go to the second payment, and then in a very short period of time, it's estimated in 12 years. That will be the #1 item on the budget. So I really need people to think about this. This is just flabbergasting. What will the United States be spending most of its money, the mode, to borrow a term from statistics? What will we be spending most of our money on? The military? No. Healthcare? No. AI? No. The interest on the debt. This is an astonishing fact.
Which is 130% of national GDP, I believe.
That's correct. That is, I don't know the exact number, but that's correct. Okay. So what's at stake in this sense is nothing. It's nothing. Nothing is at stake because it's impossible to pay back and no one gives a shit about it. Literally nobody is talking about it. There was not one single question at the presidential debate or the vice presidential debate. So to answer the question economically, what's at stake? Nothing. The United States is going bankrupt. Nobody cares. That's why Hungary and other places are turning to China. We've done it to ourselves. I'm just being completely honest with you. You want to know who's responsible? I need to look in the mirror. Not you, you're Hungarians. Okay. Unless you're American, you're responsible for that. Right? Because we don't have a citizenry. There's no vox populi. There's no voice of the people that make demands upon our leaders. And in a democracy, we have to hold our leaders accountable. And we're simply not doing that. And I'm telling you, this is unsustainable. Okay, so the second part of the question. What is responsible? I mean, what is at stake? Open borders are at stake, or closed borders are at stake. That speaks to national sovereignty. Our national sovereignty is at stake. This is no small issue. So I'm just gonna, in the interest of time, I'm just gonna run down. What role ought our institutions to play in society? Is there a deep state? Vivek Ramaswamy and others want to dismantle the deep state. Government efficiency is at stake. The role of diversity, equity, and inclusion, mentioned 751 times in federal documents in the last. It began early in the Obama administration, but it didn't pick up until the Biden administration, 3 years after that. What's at stake are the kind of institutions that we want to construct in society. What's at stake are the kind of laws that we want to make. What's at stake is what role merit should play in the society. What's at stake are the, getting back to the economic things, the percentage of graduated income tax that Americans pay, which by Scandinavian standards is rather low, and also by European standards it's low, and it peaks at the top distribution, the top quartile in particular. I think what's at stake in terms of what kind of country we want to have is from the cultural issues. I hope this answer is, I'm trying to categorize these, I hope this answer is clear, but from the cultural issues, what's at stake is a kind of liberty that I think that we're losing in the country. And I see that liberty being lost by hiring someone and promoting someone and advancing certain causes on something other than merit. And the Democrats believe that, I'm speaking broadly, I should probably say progressives and not Democrats. The progressives, which have largely taken over the Democratic causes, believe that the systems itself are fundamentally flawed and perpetuate biases and inherently discriminatory practices. The Republicans do not believe that. I do not believe that, and I'm not a Republican. The difference is that the Republicans, for so long, Republicans did not address the disparities, and the consequence of that was, and again, I'm going to be incredibly blunt with you, crazy people came along with insane ideas to try to fix those disparities. So, for example, instead of saying, okay, so we need to provide everyone with a public education of the first rate, people from broken homes, they don't have food, so we need to make sure that they have good food in the schools. We need to make sure that there's a head start for kids who's, from broken homes who have to work. Republicans didn't want any of that. And the consequence to not having that was, in aggregate, the people, that's why I mentioned the misery index, the people who suffered the most in those circumstances thought that the system was unfair and rigged against them, which they could have solved all of this problem right from the beginning. They didn't, and the consequence of them not having to is, as Nietzsche would say, right under the noses, the far left captured the institutions. And they came up with, like, they went to crazy town. They came up with insane ideas oh my God, there were so many crazy ideas, that's why I'm pausing. But they came up with crazy ideas like equity, like the way that we fix problems is to jerry-rig outcomes as opposed to giving everybody equality of opportunity. Anyway, I'm sorry, it's a long answer, but it really is the question of the night. So if you vote for Trump or you vote for Harris, you're really voting for a way that you want the country to look. That's what you're voting for.
And I would agree with the merit. I agree with something you said, particularly with the merit-based society. Basically, that's why I hinted at, and both of us, I believe, briefly touched upon it, and we can go in depth if there's interest in that, in the difference between equality and equity, which at the end of the day comes down to the question of, do people actually believe in the so-called American dream? I believe it was the Wall Street Journal that published a poll about a year ago of what people think about the American dream, and I believe just below the majority, so 55-ish%.
I saw that.
Yeah, and they believed in the American dream, but it was alarming large number or proportion of people, what, 16, 20% or so, that not only said that the American dream is not alive anymore, they actually flat out said that it never existed. It was a flat out lie. Which I would, argue against, I believe, but that shows how much faith, and especially I assume the Gen Z or young generations have in their perspective in that country, which eventually will determine their input in any field, so economically, culturally, intellectually, generally in the future. And it's hard. It's hard. I talk with people who are in their 20s. I was just in Washington, D.C. It's a waterhead. It's not representative of the country. I get it. But I talk with people, young university students, and they complain basically that there's no chance that they, for example, would buy a home. Not even with a loan, at least not in the areas that they wish to live, which in some parts of the country, as you mentioned, particularly in the West Coast, particularly from the Bay Area in San Francisco, to just live in droves to the inner parts of the country. And the sad thing is, I believe, is not only that they're leaving, but they actually bring some of the, and this is the mind-boggling thing to me, for example, that they bring those policies or that way of thinking with them. This is a strange thing, is that the high taxation and these and some of the ideas that you briefly mentioned, but there are lots of ideas in this regard that we can go into well, you could definitely go into detail, particularly when it comes to California. I heard similar ideas from large cities on the East Coast, particularly, for example, D.C.
Can you talk about that? I think that's such an important point. The idea that you leave a place, and you see this with Muslim immigrants in Europe. You leave a place, and then you bring the values and try to construct the very reasons that you fled. You try to mold your new communities to those ideals. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I agree, and I really, apart from ideological, hard-headedness, I don't know what's the right term here. I cannot put any explanation behind it, to be honest, which will eventually, and I might be wrong. I'm not sure, but that will eventually change the electoral map in the medium and the long run. On the other side, we'll see how, for example, mass immigration would change the electoral map, let's say, on the West Coast with, and this is my hunch in the long run, but this is a different topic here. For example, how the Spanish Americans or Latino who will eventually become Americans in the long run, even though they're deemed to be Democrat, in the medium and long run, I believe they will eventually turn Republican, or even earlier than that. That's my biggest question, by the way, that's the thing that I'm looking forward to the upcoming election with the exit polls of how the African American and the Latino votes will look on the Trump side, because that was actually more in 2020 than 2016, simply put, because some of these policies, at the local level at least, are actually so bizarre or so insane at some points that they actually harm the very same groups that they were intended to help. I'll just give you one example.
It's a great point.
It's an African-American friend of mine pointed out that, for example, in large cities, single mothers, particularly single African-American mothers, receive support from the local government, city or city council, or one local government in terms of housing, up until the point they remarry or they basically enter a new relationship. If they do that, then they lose the eligibility for the funds now, or the support. Now this is a problem because in essence it basically suggests or implies that we're not, and I'm not saying that that's the rationale, but they actually implied that we only give you support, living support, if you are a single mother, and therefore you're not motivated to actually form a complete family, to find a husband. Now that's a problem, because that actually, I believe, contributes to the large crime rates among African-American young people. Young boys, in particular, in large cities like Chicago or in New York City.
Right.
So these are kind of counterproductive policies. I'll give you another example, and I'm curious of what you think about that, because I heard that in illegal immigrants in so-called sanctuary cities, which is a legal thing in the federal system. It basically means that most of the illegal immigrants are completely harmless in terms of, public security. Sure, they came in illegally, but they are useful members of society, and up until the point they breach the law and they commit any sort of crime, up until that point, they basically should not be harmed. And hence the term sanctuary cities or even sanctuary states, where in the federal system, the local or state government says, we're not going to play you off to the basically the federal agencies that are responsible to get you out of the country. Now, some of these sanctuary policies, for example, in New York City, include basically support, financial support to illegal immigrants, housing, and even, for example, I believe cards, debit cards, in worth of $310, $320. It's hard to tell from Budapest, to be honest, because I heard all kinds of scenarios of how much money they receive, and it's none of my business in a sense. But if I want to understand the local issues, I mean, first of all, who pays for it? That's question number one. Number two, although I have a guess, but question number two, I mean, is it true or not? I asked a friend of mine who lives in New York City, and she told me that, well, to be honest, she herself hasn't seen it directly, so she cannot comment on it, which is an odd answer, but anyway, I believe her. But here's the thing. She does have a maid who comes in, well, basically a Latina, basically a house cleaner, who comes in, and she's furious because, well, on the one hand, she would be happy that her second cousins or third cousins come over from the other side of the border. The family sort of reunites. That's the good thing. On the other hand, she herself, I mean, she came here, in the United States legally. It took her, 15 years to do so. Nobody ever helped her. So the whole idea of merit that you mentioned basically goes out the window. And eventually, the higher and the higher she gets through hard work in society, the chances increase that the person who will fund these policies through local taxes will be her. Of course, in this case, in her case, the American dream gets further and further, because basically these policies force her to support other groups that are, again, normally welcome. They do not pose any threat to society in general, but these policies are just not sustainable in the long run. These are just two specific examples. I don't know what you heard about this New York City law, to be honest, but I'm not sure about the details, but I do know that I heard similar stories, Section 8 policies in Washington, D.C., for example, when it comes to housing.
React on that, Peter,
I want to react, because I think what you said is really important. So we have two issues there. One issue is immigration, and in the interest of time, I won't touch it. But something that you said I didn't say at all, and I should have, and I thank you for saying that, and it's America has a violence problem right now. And very few people are talking about it. We've always had a gun problem, depending on what one means by problem. But so there's some controversy. If you look at the exit polls for people for why they vote, if you look at the polling of people, my friend Michael Schellenberger ran for governor of California, and one of he ran against Gavin Newsom. One of the main concerns of people was the violent crime. And we know where the violent crime is coming from. It's coming from a few areas. It's interesting sitting here talking to a Hungarian audience. When you mentioned the crime among African Americans, nobody even, nothing. Like, nobody was like, Like, you can't say that in the United States. Like, if you said that in the United States, someone would get up.
Well, it's not exclusively them, of course. I'm just
No,
saying
but I
that
mean, like, literally, when you said that, nobody batted an eye. No one's like, yeah. But you don't say that in the United States. You're not allowed to speak about that. But you can speak about, like, the work that Roland Fryer has done at Harvard, where he took a look at, is it really the case that, because if you listen to many of the progressives, you think that there's a genocide among black people, police officers are murdering black citizens. That's just not true. I mean, that's just completely false. And if you look at the data in terms of unarmed black men being shot by police, it's less than 10. It's under 10, fewer than 10 people. But my point is that violence is a voting issue. You're asked what's at stake. I'm not saying Trump or Harris or anyone's going to do better. I'm not saying anything. But when you look at why people vote in certain regions, and what's super interesting is that those regions are almost universally blue. Blue means Democrat. Almost universally blue. Cities, people are concerned about violent crime, and they're particularly concerned about gun homicide. And some of that, we haven't really touched on this either, is due to fentanyl. Some of that is due to homelessness. Some of that is due, in the city where I just fled, is due to tent camping. You don't have any tent camping in Hungary. Last time I was in Hungary was 2 years ago. And one of the things that I've seen a few differences. Inflation is high here. Everything costs more money. I see far more homeless people here than I did 2 years ago. But I still see no tent camping. I have not seen a single tent in this whole country. Go to Portland, Oregon, and check out the tent camping. And, so just a very quick anecdote. So my daughter was growing up. My daughter's in college now. I don't really like to police people, how they dress or what have you, but I would never let my daughter go out of the house dressed in anything that was even remotely suggestive. And the reason isn't because I'm some kind of sexual conservative. Honestly, I couldn't care less. But the path from my house, and I live in a middle-class neighborhood, staunchly, squarely middle-class neighborhood, all you would have to do is go around the corner, literally a half a block, and then walk down the street, and it was lined with tents and campers, and you just don't see that here. But anyway, but that's a voting issue for people, but only in certain areas, not in Florida. Not in Naples, I can assure you of that. I didn't even see any homeless people in Naples. Not in Texas. So that's another thing that people could say to answer to your previous question, what's at stake?
Right, I wanted to tell you to react on Gábor's point shortly.
Okay.
All right, but back to the list of the questions. I have to ask the official question, right?
You give her the questions, and
I'll be brief. The first question is coming. What are the key factors that could shape the 2024 election? Answer the question shortly in 3 minutes, please.
I'll answer it very quickly. A future assassination attempt, some economic indicator being up or down, a scandal that someone has, like an actual scandal. Trump is almost immune to scandals at this point, but it would have to be a scandal like the Jerry Epstein client list got released, something with children, would be something sexual with children, like an actual scandal. That would tip the election.
I believe 2 or 3 things. One is basically to follow up on the international crisis, particularly in the Middle East. If the war escalates between Israel and Iran, that might have an impact on the election. Foreign policy generally is not an important thing when it comes to U.S. elections because, as you quoted, it's the economy still going back to the 1990s. I checked out the Pew Research Service poll late September. Foreign policy is ranked number 4 on the list. Normally it's around, ranked 6 or 7 or something like that. Economy and healthcare are the top issues, as they usually are. Supreme Court judges, third one. The foreign policy is ranked on number 4, particularly with regards to Ukraine and the war between Israel and Hamas. So I would say we're in international crisis. By the way, that's one of the most tense things that not necessarily impact the elections, but impact the period after the elections. Mm-hmm. If for some reason we won't have a president, let's say until, I don't know, the 10th of November, I just, pinpointed the date there, because either we don't have the results yet, or, all the votes not, counted yet, or because one of the candidates question, that or this or that state, or the result of this or that state. In other words, if we have an interval, period, a question period of who will be the actual next president of the United States, that's actually a problematic issue, because that could cause kind of an open window for escalation in any area of the world in terms of crises.
Yeah, two things piggybacking off of that. The other thing, to answer your question directly, that would change the results of the election is a black swan event. For example, a weapon of mass destruction going off in a United States city. That would benefit Trump. When I was growing up, my parents used to tell me, my father always voted Democrat for one reason. He didn't really care about anything, but he wanted a woman's right to abortion. We don't really think about that's just not an issue anymore. So the Supreme Court, I'm glad you said that, that's not an issue anymore.
Right. I don't know why it would rank number 3, to be honest, but normally it should be an important issue. One specific example of what could impact the election, less dramatic but very important. People, pollsters especially, try to highlight of which particular type of voter changes scams, and they sort of lean towards the other side, so to say. We talked about African Americans, and the Latino vote might increase for the Trump ticket. I believe an important segment of society is suburban white women, which basically gave the presidency to Trump in 2016, and then they turned their back on him in 2020. We don't know what's the case now. I mean, Kamala Harris is polling much better among women than Donald Trump, obviously, but not that much better that you would expect. So it is possible that she's gaining a lot of support, but only among a certain group of women. So you cannot look at women in general in the U.S. Electorate as one, unified single monolith. It's important because in the last 3 or 4 decades, actually, there are more women who are registered to vote, and more women actually show up to vote in the elections. And one thing, it's a good thing that you mentioned the book on the evangelical Christian movement in the United States. There's a poll from, not a poll, sorry, a poll and an analysis that the Arizona Christian University published about a week ago that says that evangelical Christians are actually characterized with apathy when it comes to the upcoming elections. In other words, they won't show up to vote because they either lost faith in the whole system, right, or because they just don't seem to trust, let alone, not Kamala Harris, but particularly Donald Trump in particular, which is an odd statement after 4 years of the Trump presidency that was very much supportive of the evangelical cause, or, if I may say so, agenda. But if they don't show up to vote, and we'll see whether that poll analysis is correct, we're talking about several million people here. If they don't show up to vote, that in certain districts, let's say in Arizona, or in North Carolina, in Georgia, could actually take away that state from the Trump campaign. And the reason I highlight the Trump campaign is because these voters are usually regarded as the rock-solid Trump base. I mean, if you recall Donald Trump's popularity during his presidency and after his presidency was always around 40–41%. I believe it was the 2018 migration crisis when it fell below 40%. Apart from that, it was always around 41%, no matter what the guy did. It was always 41%, because there was a hardcore fan base, not exclusively, but to a large extent, composed by the evangelical communities, the various evangelical voters. And if they don't show up to vote this time, that could actually have an impact in itself on the outcome.
And that was good, because we stuck to 3 minutes.
Exactly.
We did not talk a lot on foreign issues, for example. Again, there are many issues we have to go through anyway. How have recent changes in American society and politics set the stage for the upcoming votes? But we thought we'd discuss this issue. All right, okay. Anything you want to add?
Next question.
Right. Where do Hungarian-American relations stand amidst these political dynamics?
So where do the bilateral relationships stand in the next presidency, if I understand correctly? Well, I would say that obviously you can see it from the statements either from the Trump campaign or from the Hungarian government that And I don't want to, repeat obvious statements that that there's definitely a strong bond between the Hungarian Prime Minister and the former President of the United States, which was actually confirmed by analysts on the other side of the Atlantic. So it's not just something that the media picked up. That's a real thing going on there. The reason I pointed out in my first remark the presidential system, so in other words, the importance of Congress, because certain issues, even though foreign policy belongs to the president, certain issues, to get fixed or to actually improve relations, should have at least the support of at least one house, particularly the Senate. For example, the agreement on the avoidance of double taxation, which was highlighted in Hungarian media for a while. Even though it was related to the global minimum tax issue, that thing actually stalled in the Senate already in 2010. So, for example, that's the area where that could be solved in the long run. Or even, for example, whomever the second Trump presidency, or President Donald Trump would appoint if he would win, whoever he would appoint to be the ambassador to Budapest, which also makes a difference, at least when it comes to political communication in the two capitals. That's also dependent on the support of and consent and support of the Senate. So, so for the bilateral relations, I believe the general mood and the just the conversation style or communication style is the one thing that most obviously would change under a Trump presidency. Under a Harris presidency, I'm not sure, to be honest, because I would argue that a Harris foreign policy. Here's the interesting thing: Donald Trump is usually regarded as somebody who is completely hard to calculate with, because nobody knows what he's going to pull off, and there is that generally, I believe, an agreement that what are the reasons for that. That being said, I mean, we have 4 years of experience of his type of leadership or his type of foreign policy so far. I'm not saying that that's a guarantee of how things will look in the next second term, but the point is there's something you can build on. When it comes to a Harris foreign policy, all bets are off, because it is most likely that there will be a progressive turn, a progressive internationalism coming, and I don't want to argue against it, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that the problem with a progressive internationalist foreign policy is that although it has a huge not huge, but a large literature in foreign policy analysis, it doesn't have a tradition, at least in the last 100 years or so. So it's hard to say how that would impact generally foreign policy, and particularly Central and Eastern Europe and Hungary. Yeah. And that's why I highlighted the Trump line. And of course, again, the House, because I just want to point out, for example, let's say sanctions policies. A lot of the sanctions are actually pushed forward by the United States Congress. And if there's a large amount of vote behind a proposal for sanction that the executive is mandated to carry out, then he has to carry it out, unless it's impeachment time. So, so that's why I highlighted the House and particularly the Senate. That's where I believe a change could bring, in addition to, let's say, a Trump victory, right, at least from the Hungarian government's perspective.
Right. Let me recapitulate the original question for Peter. How do you see, as an American citizen, as American, the Orban-Trump relation today, and how will you see after the elections?
I agree with
after a Trump success.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said except the very end. So I think that it would be good for Hungary. I tell you what, who's going to be out of a job if Trump gets in is David Pressman, the ambassador. You can rest assured that he will be out of a job. I think one of the things that you're going to see is a continued closeness between Hungary and the United States. I thank you for mentioning the double taxation thing, because I think that will be the end. I predict if Harris gets in, double taxation will be the least of the issues. I think that she will. You agree?
Probably. I mean, double taxation is more of an issue for the Hungarian side, less so for the American side, because they can go around it. But yeah, sorry, don't want to.
No. So I think it would be very good for Hungary if Trump got in. I think Harris is predictive in her overt hostility, because you got to remember, this really is people are looking at this as, there's an expression in English, a zero-sum game. An example like chess is a zero-sum game. If it's good for one party, it's bad for another. If it's bad for one, it's good for the other. So in this particular election, this really is a conception of a zero-sum game. And so I think because of, I think that because of Trump's closeness to Orban, and I think because the existing democratic infrastructure and political leanings have not even an overt pathological hatred toward Fidesz and Orban, but a conspicuous hatred. I think it would be bad for Hungary, and I think it would be bad for Hungarians, and I think it would be certainly bad for Americans living here. And I think exactly the opposite is the case if Trump gets in. And that's my sincere, I'm not endorsing anybody, I'm just telling you that's honestly how I see it.
Right. Okay, now I give the floor to the audience to have some questions. Do you have some? But please, short questions and short answers. Is it
Short answers, 3 minutes like before we did.
No. I'll give you the mic. And I'm happy to see my Corvinist students here anyway. You can also have some questions.
You mentioned about the globalization losers, right, in the US. There is the AI losers we're not talking about.
The AI losers.
If globalization centralized, AI is multiple times globalization.
Happy to talk
And
about that.
nowhere in the political arena, not in Hungary, not in the States, not in China. Nobody's speaking because I don't know why.
I'm happy to talk about that. The big loser in the coming AI revolution, and we're not talking about 20 years, best estimates from Sam Altman and people who know about this, we're talking about 2 years. So big, I would identify 3 losers in that. One, it's anybody who uses a laptop for a living. The laptop class is screwed. 2, it's American soft power. What do I mean by that? I mean in a very short period of time, not only within my lifetime, again, I'm talking like 2 to 3 years, 5 tops, you're going to see the ability for people to make their own movies on demand and on the fly and make their own music. And I think one consequence of that, one of the reasons Americans are so successful is because we're really good at spreading our music. We're really good at spreading our movies. People see that when they grow up. They see that as kids. I think that, well, now with the advent of Bollywood in India, you see a kind of a dent in that, but I think AI is going to put a further dent in that.
Thank you for your question, and you're absolutely right. Nobody talks about that, and I believe some of the challenges are, well, they are already here. I believe one of the losers, and just that relates to soft power, education and partly academia. I mean, we see it already here. I mean, here at the university, for example. I mean, how on earth can you tell that a university student actually wrote their thesis with AI unless they're very, very sloppy? And I encountered that, by the way, and some of my colleagues encountered that they actually just copy-pasted what artificial intelligence told them, and then they left in the line. But you have to be really, really sloppy to do that. Otherwise, it's going back to the old school oral exams, because there's no way you could actually make sure that the students comply with the regulations. So I would say that some of the people who work in education and academia, which is technically the future of research and development, and in generally the higher added value segments of the economy, or they provide the foundations for that. They are the first losers, and they are already losers, I believe, in my humble opinion, if I may say so. The only thing I saw so far, and not on this rationale, but how this is targeted, is just sporadic. So, for example, the Biden administration introduced embargoes in October of 2022 and 2023 with regards to microchips that relate to AI and high-performance chips, but that's a different issue, so not necessarily related to what you raised. So I'm not sure whether there's actually a proper answer by a political class or politician to that question, even though it's highly relevant. I fully agree with you. One brief note: you mentioned the it would be less.
Or less.
You mentioned the national debt, how that's an issue. The Committee on for Responsible State Responsible Budget actually put together the campaign promises by Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, and both of them will increase the national debt.
Correct.
Actually,
Correct.
Trump will even increase it more if things to be. So even in these more simpler issues, there's no clear answer. sadly, but you're right.
10-second answer for one other loser. 10 seconds. Taiwan. Next.
In my courses, there are only old school oral exams. There's another question.
Do you think there is a fallacy in polling that the Trump voters are much more hesitant to tell their opinions to the pollsters?
Great question.
Than the Kamala voters?
Great question.
And another question, what do you think the popular sentiment is on the Ukraine? I'm asking about the popular sentiment, not about the Kamala and Trump themselves.
Great question. Quick answer. I think the last time Donald Trump won, the reason everyone was so shocked was because no one would say they're going to vote for Trump. That's much less so the case now. I think popular sentiment is divided. I think among a more kind of the intelligentsia class, you see that we want to continue to fund Ukraine. We look at that as a kind of proxy, and we want to continue to bankrupt the Russians. But kind of the person on the street, they don't want to give money to Ukraine. Even the economy now in the United States is an expression, going gangbusters, going extremely well. Inflation's more or less under control at the moment. The Fed just lowered interest rates again. I think in general the sentiment is against funding Ukraine in general, unless you're talking about the elite educated class.
Very short answer. I concur that I wouldn't say that there's no such thing as a Trump hiding voter or somebody who's being silent, but there's definitely that's less of the case than in 2016 or even 2020. So, for example, in Virginia, which is a blue state in general, you can see Trump signs. Not all across the state, but not far away from Washington, D.C., which is also blue. So they're not hiding it anymore.
Yeah, real quick, he's going to kill me, but real quick, I have a friend of mine who lives in Portland, and she was telling me that there's no way that anybody could put a Trump sign in Portland. It would be ripped out, people would throw rocks at your house. So I do think that I'm going to temper my answer and say that that's in general, and it's not localized to hyper blue areas.
All right, there's another question.
So my question is about like endorsements of the different candidates and their importance or significance. For example, Taylor Swift endorsing Kamala Harris or Elon Musk endorsing Trump. We've seen this before in previous elections, but it seems more like more importance or more attention has been put on this. Do you think this has any more relevance or importance now, or is this will this actually affect more the election, or is this just like the previous elections?
Thank you for the question. I think you can see that both sides are trying to pull out, and especially the Democrats try to pull out the big guns, like Taylor Swift and just recently, I believe, Eminem. So basically, the star and
Bruce Springsteen.
Right, and but I don't think that it would have much of an impact apart from mobilizing the hardcore, because the problem with just in short with celebrities on both sides of the aisle, but you can find them in larger numbers among Democrats. The problem with celebrities is that once they gone political, and I believe, and this is a different topic, but just one sentence. That's the main problem with the entertainment media in general, and with talk shows and with late night shows in general. That once celebrities and people in the entertainment industry turn political, regardless of the election, that basically kind of limits their impact, because eventually their endorsement is politicized in a sense that people start to believe, in my opinion, that well they're just against playing the experts. They try to step in on both sides of the aisle. I emphasize they try to step in. They try to tell me, the consumer, a political person of whom to vote for, and I believe they are successful in among people who would vote in that that direction anyway. But apart from that, I don't think that they would be game changers in this regard. The only thing that they could do is that they could mobilize the base, which is also important. Don't get me wrong. Again, hinting to the evangelicals, if they don't show up, that's also a problem. But apart from that, I don't think that they would make much of a difference.
All right. Any other questions, remarks on that? Okay, the last one.
My question is about the Chinese relations. How the President Trump, if he is elected, will see the Hungarian government's strong relations to China?
That, my friend, is the billion-dollar question. I do not know the answer to that. I do not think anybody knows the answer to that. But that's the one question that we all need to know the answer to. I don't, as far as I know, he hasn't said anything. It's a great question.
I don't know the answer either, but what I can tell you is that probably that issue might not be settled on a bilateral basis, but well, even if not, bilateral American-Hungarian basis, but rather on a transatlantic basis, and one of the partners or other side that Washington D.C. or the federal government would argue with would probably be the federal German government. So I believe that's where most of the debates will be pushed upon, which Donald Trump has a tendency to do anyway. I mean, if you recall his presidency, at one point, I believe it was 2019, when he said that it was under the Merkel chancellorship, that he likes it when the Germans give him negative feedback, that they don't like his policies, because that's just indication that he's doing it correctly and right, which is kind of odd feedback if you ask me. But the point is, he has a tendency to focus on Germans as problematic partners anyway, and I believe that particular issue with trade relations with China, and particularly the technological relations with China, will probably be settled with Germany first and foremost. Especially since some of the companies that are related to this issue with EV industry is basically German companies.
All right.
Happen to be in Hungary.
Do you have final remarks?
I was going to make a prediction. I'm big into predictions. As my friend Michael Shermer says, don't tell anybody you're smart, make a prediction. I'll make a prediction. My prediction is that the relationship between Hungary and China will erode if Trump gets in, and it will be strengthened if Harris gets in.
All right. Okay, thank you very much for the speakers. Thank you much for your discipline. And thank you much for the questions from the audience, and thank you very much for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you for the Hungarian Scruton Hub. And how can we sum up this conversation? We will see next week. Thank you.
Thank you.